Fellas, commentary in the UFC is always a big discussion. Some people have a favourite commentator that they like and they hate others, and then just people have big opinions on the main commentators in the UFC. So I'm going to be going through all the major commentators in the UFC, and when I say major commentators, I mean like the big ones, not the ones that do an event every now and then, or the backup commentators. I'm talking about the regular commentators that we'll see on an average fight night, so average pay-per-view. So I'm going to be going through the biggest problem that all these commentators seem to have. Let me know your thoughts on these commentators, if you agree with the biggest problem. Starting off with Joe Rogan. Now, Joe Rogan is a knowledgeable guy, but I'd say the biggest problem with Joe Rogan on commentary is the fact that he only shows up to like American pay-per-view events. When is Joe Rogan? On a day-to-day, on a week-to-week basis, but Joe Rogan is never there. He never attends fight nights regardless of where they are. If they're in the Apex, you're never going to see Rogan. And I understand he's a busy guy, he's got his podcast, he's a busy guy in general, he's got businesses, but I just wish we showed Rogan more often. If a UFC event is in a different country, like the UK or Brazil or Australia, wherever the event is, if it's not in America, specifically like Vegas or MSG or Miami, the chances are you're not going to see Joe Rogan. And the fact that he's barely in these events, he's got to let him down for me. I mean, how many events does he cover a year? Because he only covers the American pay-per-views. I'd say, 8-9 events Joe Rogan will be there a year, when UFC's on pretty much a weekly basis and Rogan's probably not even there for 15 events a year. That's saying something, man. So, Joe Rogan, the fact that he only shows up to the Vegas and the American events, and I understand why he does it, he's a busy guy, but I just wish we saw him more often. We never see him at fight nights. We never see him in, like, events in a different country. Even if it's a stacked card, you're never going to see Rogan there. And for that reason, I've got to let him down. He only seems to attend the big cards. I'm not hating on him. I'm not saying he has to change it or anything like that. I'm not demanding a change, but for me, that has to let Joe Rogan down a little bit. The fact that he doesn't show up to a weekly card show, and you can kind of tell when he's on like some pay-per-views, because he doesn't commentate every event and obviously doesn't research a lot of the fighters, he's having to rely on just pre-written research, a lot of the commentary on these big events when it's to like the prelims and the early prelims to fighters that he hasn't watched, which can let him down as well. So for Joe Rogan, I'd say that we don't see him on every event. That has to let him down a little bit. Then we've got Michael Bisping. He's kind of like the replacement for Joe Rogan whenever Joe Rogan's not at a pay-per-view. You're always going to see Mike Bisping in UK events, and he's usually a regular commentator for fight nights as well. I'd say the biggest problem for Bisping, well, there's two, but I'd say the main biggest problem is his bias, specifically towards British fighters. I understand he's good friends with Aspinall. He's obviously from the UK. He's obviously going to want the British fighter to win, but it shows a lot on commentary. Go and watch Tom Aspinall versus Marcin Tybura, and I understand Aspinall was leading the dance in that fight until he got the finish, but there was absolutely nothing said about Marcin Tybura that entire fight. I think it was like 10 or 15 seconds into the fight, Aspinall throws a body kick, and Bisping called it like a punishing body kick, and it didn't even affect Tybura at all. Don't get me wrong, it was a good body kick, but I'd say he over-exaggerates everything Aspinall did. Imagine Bisping, look at the celebration he had to Aspinall beating Pavlovich. Imagine Bisping was commentating Aspinall versus Pavlovich. It would have been the most biased commentary ever. Even on UFC London, you go to any UFC UK event, and whenever there's like a fighter that's not from the UK fighting a fighter that's from the UK, he'll only ever talk about the fighter from the UK, unless the fighter who isn't from the UK is like dominantly winning the fight. So I think he's got the fact that he's got a lot of bias towards certain fighters definitely lets him down. DC has that problem as well. And I'd say the other problem about Bisping is that I feel like sometimes he makes it about himself a lot. Like, we get it, you're a fighter. Nearly every commentator besides Rogan and Anik is. You know what I mean? Like, you don't always have to compare a rematch to your fight with Dan Henderson. You don't always have to remind us that you used to fight as well. You've been there, you've got the medal, you've done it. Fair play to you. But it's about the fighters, it's not about you. So I'd say those are the two major problems I have with Bisping on commentary. The fact that he makes it about himself a lot, and the fact that he just tends to be biased towards British fighters. Then we've got DC. DC is a very knowledgeable commentator, but I'd say the biggest problem with DC is this guy has the most lackluster reactions ever. You could see a fighter get decapitated, you could see the fastest knockout in UFC history, whatever it may be, and DC's reaction is just him pulling a sad face. Doesn't matter who gets knocked out, doesn't matter how spectacular the knockout is, it could be one of the best knockouts in UFC history, Max Holloway versus Justin Gaethje, and DC's reaction will be him saying, oh, looking at the fight with a sad face, and then every now and then looking at Rogan and saying that was ridiculous or that was crazy. look at the most iconic knockouts. You go on, like, for example, the UFC have like the biggest commentator reactions of 2023. DC's always had the most lackluster reactions. He's got no reaction at all. You've got Joe Rogan going crazy. You've got John Anik practically having a seizure. And you've got DC looking like he's just walking up from a nap and you don't have a clue what's going on. So the lackluster reactions, in my opinion, definitely let DC down as a commentator. And like I said with Bisping, I'm not going to go in too much for this one, but he does tend to have, you know, quite a bit of a biased opinion. Whenever there's like Dagestani fighters or American fighters like Gaethje, or just people who he likes in general, he does tend to be quite biased towards them and only specifically talk about them. But yeah, the lackluster reactions is, in my opinion, the main problem with DC. Then we've got John Anik. Now, John Anik is generally a good commentator. There's not much bad things I can say about John Anik. He's very professional, and to be honest, I kind of think he's an upgrade from Mike Goldberg, which is crazy because Mike Goldberg's a goated commentator. But I'd say the biggest problem with Anik is the fact that he doesn't really have insight on the fight themselves. You've got guys like Bisping, Cruz, Felder, DC, who is obviously former fighters who have turned into commentators, so they usually have a clue what's going on, whereas I feel like John Anik is never able to break down what's going on in the fight, whether it's wrestling exchanges, striking exchanges, whatever it may be. You're never going to see John Anik breaking down what's actually going on in the fight. He doesn't really tend to have actual knowledge on the... Well, I don't want to say he doesn't have knowledge, but you know what I mean? He can't really break down what's going on in the fight because he doesn't really have experience fighting. But he's a very professional guy, but the fact that he doesn't really have insight on the fight themselves, he's kind of just like the human Siri. You know, he's always going to tell you the best tale of the tape. He's always going to give you the most random facts, whatever it may be. He's the professional voice of commentary, but he doesn't really tend to break things down during the actual fight. So I'd say everything but the actual fight is what's good for John Anik. And then we've got Dominick Cruz. Dominick Cruz does his homework, but I just feel like this guy consistently has bad takes. I feel like he's always shitting on fighters. He's always giving the problems fighters. He doesn't really big up any fighters, give them credit. It seems like he always just shits on fighters and hates on them. There's also the iconic moment of Nurmagomedov versus McGregor, when Nurmagomedov was destroying McGregor with ground and pound, and he's saying that McGregor's trying to gas out Khabib Nurmagomedov. That was a terrible take for a guy that's supposed to be one of the smartest out there in Dominick Cruz. He's consistently got kind of bad takes, does Dominick Cruz, and I feel like the UFC community as a whole, we've kind of got sick of seeing Dominick Cruz on every fight night, every pay-per-view event. Whenever we've got Bisping and Cruz as well, I've noticed this about these two specific guys. Whenever those two are on commentary, I feel like they're always trying to banter each other. And don't get me wrong, I don't mind the banter between the two of them, but at the end of the day, when they're still sat there bantering each other, when there's a fight going on, when there's an important fight going on, and they sat there trying to crack jokes to each other, it's not the most professional thing to listen to. It's not the best thing to listen to as a fan as well. So I feel like the combination of Cruz and Bisping, like the nightmare commentary trio, would be DC, Cruz, and Bisping, in my opinion. Not that they're necessarily the three worst. I just don't think they go well together. So yeah, that's my opinion on Cruz, and that is the biggest problem, in my opinion, with every big commentator in the UFC. Obviously, I'm not going to go through every single commentator like Laura Sanko, John Gooden, and Paul Felder. I'm only going to be talking about the major commentators, the main commentators, and that is, in my opinion, the biggest problem that they all have. Something that maybe they could improve, or maybe they just can't improve it. But yeah, that's my thoughts on the major commentators, the biggest problems that they have. I might do another video in response to this, you know, doing the best thing about every major commentator in the UFC. But let me know your least favourite thing about all these commentators and the biggest problem that they all have. And thank you for watching.